Hello and welcome. I'm glad you could join me. I have a woman on tonight that I've wanted to have on for a long, long time, Ann Gearity is my guest. Many of you in the mental health world, probably most of you, know Ann Gearity's name. She's a licensed independent clinical social worker. She has her PhD. She's been working here in Minnesota in many capacities. You're in private practice. Yeah. She has 3 departments at the university where she is working as a faculty member, social work school, psychiatry, and then the infant mental health. Busy woman. She also gives workshops, does workshops, and is a consultant, working a lot with the Minneapolis public schools. So I'm delighted you could come down, and we're going to talk tonight about her work, specifically some about her work in the field of what she calls developmental repair, working with kids, but also it can be adults who are anxious, who are having problems with aggression and assertiveness should be brought in. And I'll have her explain it more, but welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Mary. I'm glad to be here.
How did you evolve and start thinking about kids who were dealing with aggressiveness and high-risk kids? How did your focus come to that?
Well, Mary, when I started, as happens when you're, 22 and just coming out of college, I was working with very poor and a lot of kids in the foster care system, or children who were kind of displaced from their families. And I was always intrigued by the ones who were fighting. There was some energy there that was both scary and so admirable. So it stayed in my mind. And as I started teaching, I kept thinking about what was it that allowed them to keep pushing, even when their lives were so hard, and what was it that tripped them up. So I just was really interested in them when I started to teach around a time when there was a lot of research about trying to understand behavior in ways that were much more meshing with what we were knowing about the human brain and the human body. And it was just fortuitous that I had an opportunity to put all those pieces together and try to find a way that we could be effective. That was the big thing. I think a lot of times these children were fighting and we were fighting them back.
So it wasn't a win-win situation for
it was
either.
a lose-lose.
A lose-lose.
Oh, yes.
And this period where you really dug in and started doing more research, was that when you were getting your PhD in Chicago?
So during the 90s, they talked about the decade of the brain.
Right.
And we certainly have not figured out the brain,
no,
but we
still
started.
A frontier.
And there was so much wonderful research about attachment, social learning, stress and trauma, memory and perception. So I just was the recipient of all this wonderful research and got to put it together into what do we do with these very young kids.
And when you say their behavior, the kids who were acting out, if we use that phrase, was admirable and also scary. Do you think there was an energy that these kids had to fight that really all children or all people should have more of that energy?
Well, it comes from 2 sources. One is our basic biology, fight, flight. Right. And so when you're scared, your body tries to survive. And the second thing that I was so impressed with is that even though these children had incredible adversities, there was a desire to stay connected, even though they did it badly. In this age of football, I'll remind you that, the best defense is a good offense. And they were children who were just fighting all the time. But we were responding to them with disdain and with criticism and often with control. So they really were twice damaged and
ostracized,
and
really.
ostracized and accused of doing it on purpose, as if they were choosing, when I think they were struggling.
Her basic premise, and tell me if I'm quoting you right, is young children do not behave badly on purpose. And I think that's so exciting, and I think all parents and grandparents and teachers, helping persons in the child's life, can think about that.
Well, none of us act randomly. We act with purpose, but that purpose is not always to make people mad. We use our behavior to signal our needs. And for young children who don't have a lot of language, that's the epitome of parenting, trying to decode what your toddler is needing.
Right.
And so that idea that there's a purpose then opens you up to being interested in what's the purpose and trying to figure them out. That's what good parents and grandparents do. They really stay connected and interested in their children.
But it's hard work too, isn't it?
Yes.
I know a lot of parents of different ages, and you go out to lunch or have coffee with a friend, and they're often just frustrated and challenged by their children or grandchildren who are not always doing what they want.
Well, we come from a model. Remember, it wasn't that long ago that children should be seen and not heard. And yet in the 21st century, we expect children to have opinions, to have ideas, to be able to take care of themselves. So yes, I think we get very frustrated when we try to control children. Probably the thing that I've learned most is when I talk with a child and I listen to the child, then it's not so hard. It's really hard when I want the child to do something, and it's a one-sided effort.
And that can be the child's, in a way, in a power position, isn't he or she?
Well, the child is in a power position when they don't just comply, but often they don't just comply because they don't understand what we want.
Right.
So, that ability to have conversations,
and as you said somewhere in your writing, talking with them, not at them.
Right.
With them, not at them.
I often tell parents, if you talk at your children, you risk sounding like Charlie Brown's adult. Wow, wow, wow.
And they tune it out. Wow,
and they totally tune it out, as do we.
Sure,
Nobody likes to be talked at.
What do you think are some of the main reasons kids do misbehave at school, at recess, at home?
So I think most of us misbehave once in a while because we're bored or we don't want to do something that we're supposed to. I think there's a lot of, space for a little bit of misbehavior. The children that I've started to work with over the last 20 years are those children who misbehave so chronically, not because of the usual reasons, but because they've been incredibly stressed in their life. They've been exposed to horrific experiences. They've been scared. They've been, without enough adult help. So they really misbehave because of developmental delays. They really haven't learned how to do it.
They've missed certain
They
periods,
literally have missed skills that many of us just take for granted.
And they've missed them, and because of what's going on in their environment, parents maybe who aren't able to parent.
Often parents can't parent. Sometimes parents are overwhelmed. Sometimes, we have to take responsibility for what poverty and racism and oppression have done to communities, and then we blame their children. And we just perpetuate that. So this is an opportunity to say, wait a second, we can help children. And when they come to school, we can give them a chance to catch up in a way that is incredibly meaningful. And if we don't, incredibly harmful.
Let's just talk about the kids in school for a while. The kids who are from homes where they aren't having healthy kind of parenting. Teachers nowadays are under such pressure with large classes, a lot of kids who are speaking English but not well or needing to learn. How do you expect, in a way, teachers to be able to give this kind of thoughtful attention in a way that can
what
really
I
help?
say to teachers, and that's always their lament, that they don't have time, that there's so much pressure for them to quickly teach new skills. We joke that, kindergarten is the new third grade. I mean, the pressure on teachers is enormous. The problem is that if you don't stay with children's developmental needs, you lose them. And then they hold the classes back. So I think we just have to, as a community, pause and say, everybody deserves an education. And when a child has the developmental delays, we need to pay attention to those delays and repair them and catch them up. We don't get mad at children who struggle to read. We slow it down and we help them read. But we do get mad at children who don't know how to be in groups or don't know how to follow expectations. And I think we just shortchange everyone. Teachers are often incredibly receptive when you give them a framework that helps them know what to do. I think most teachers really intend to do right by children.
Well, I agree.
But the system is really hard.
I agree. It's just there's so much pressure on them. But I'm sure your manual is something that when they see that, they say, some answers here to some of my questions and problems.
They do. The challenge is that it's a mind shift. And it really takes that intentional purpose to become effective with children. So often they're very interested and then they want more training or more support, which they totally deserve.
And can the schools bring you in, or people that work with you, to do workshops that can give them enough at this point? Or is that something that we need to really talk to our
keep going.
School boards about?
We need to talk to our school boards. We are losing so many children. And there's still a model in Minnesota that, is a pull yourself up by your bootstrap model. And some of us are privileged enough that we can have bootstraps to pull up. And then there are a lot of children who are, being left behind. And I think when we talk about human capital, we need to do better by children. I think schools are really letting children down.
And you said, too, in some of your writing that the mental health system has also failed kids. Can you just say a few words about that?
Well, many of our mental health models are either, certainly the model in psychiatry for a long time suggested that if we just got the right medicine, everything would be, fixed, and our brains are not that simplistic. But I also think that we expect things to change very, very quickly. And for many, many children, when damage happens when they're so young, it takes patience and support over time to repair what didn't happen when they were little. I'm very interested in infant mental health because early in my career, there still was a belief that if something happened before a child was 5, they wouldn't remember. And now we know the opposite. We are profoundly affected by things when we're 1 and 2 and 3 and 4.
Isn't that exciting in a way
very
to
exciting.
Comprehend? That's big information. And I don't think it's very well understood yet by the general population.
No. In research, people say it takes 20 years for information to
Really?
get into the
Sort of the
practice.
common
Isn't that
public
something?
knowledge?
So I
Oh.
started this 20 years ago. So I expect that any day we'll be just much better.
It's like, aha,
Aha,
moment,
aha. But it does. It's slow. It's slow. And this is a significant paradigm shift to think differently.
That's a neat way to put it, paradigm shift. You heard Anne say that. Can you give us an example, Anne, of a developmental need that was not attended to, that a teacher and or parents, probably both, hopefully, can work on with a young child?
Okay, so the very core of developmental repair presumes that children have to have something we call self-regulation. And self-regulation is a biological and psychological capacity to get my balance back when I'm thrown, right? And we do it all the time. I sneeze and I have to get my balance back. Now, my body knows how to regulate because I'm wired to learn it. But what we discovered that our minds learn how to regulate because we are taken care of. So attachment is really about infants and toddlers learning to become the boss of their bodies because they have caring adults who help them take care of their bodies. And gradually they go from counting on the adult to do it to doing it together, to doing it myself. And that ability to stay regulated in the face of stimulation, in the face of change, in the face of surprise, in the face of too much pressure is really at the core of our functioning. Now, again, we take it for granted, but there are lots of children who struggle to get to that regulation. And when parents can stay interested in their children instead of angry when their children are struggling, then we're working on a developmental repair.
You had a quote in the book about saying to a child who is acting out, I'm going to stay with you. I'm not going to leave you. I don't want you to hurt yourself. I don't want you to hurt me. And just that kind of present connection. And I thought that was so beautiful, really, and exciting to think of
universal.
Those words.
Yes.
And it would be so comforting to a child who's kind of out of control.
Absolutely. We know that company, our bodies are primed for company. And when we're upset, and I call you up and say, Mary, I'm upset, and you listen, my body calms. And so company is so essential. And that's one of the things that's happened with our models of childcare is that instead of going towards children when they're distressed, we get offended and we walk away from them.
How could you act like that?
How could you act like that to me when that's exactly when they need us most? So in my model, I say when children are dysregulated, that's when you want to go towards them, which is so counterintuitive to most adults, and yet it's so effective and satisfying.
So going toward them physically, going toward them emotionally, mentally, not banning them to their room.
Really thinking about what do they need, what's happening, how do I figure them out, because I'm not as dysregulated as them. So we sometimes use the word scaffolding. You know, how do we scaffold a distressed child until they can sort of get their balance back?
That's a nice image. The trick for the parent or the teacher is we get hooked into the escalation sometimes. And the child's voice rises, and the parent's voice rises, and it snowballs.
Right. And it takes patience, but it also takes what I call a disposition for kindness. When the child's voice raises and I can hold my wits about me, I can actually help that child by doing the opposite, by staying kind,
Calm.
and calm.
Stay calm and carry on. Isn't that a popular sign we see around the cities from our British history?
And it really helps children a lot when I don't respond. I walked into a classroom and a young child was startled, I'm sure, and said a very provocative thing to me. I won't say it on TV. And I just turned to him and I said, "Oh, excuse me, I surprised you. My name is Anne and I'm just visiting." And he said, "Oh." And when I tell this story, most teachers are so shocked because they assume that I am going to get this kid for, being rude. But I surprised him, and I have the wherewithal to stay calm. And then he could stay calm.
So in a way, you took the wind out of his sails.
I took the wind out of his fear.
Out of his fear. Now, that's a nice way to, better way to say it.
Yes. And what was so lovely is as I left the room 5 minutes later, he turned to me and he said, "Goodbye, Miss Anne." Oh, and I hadn't used that.
So you'd won him over.
So I won him over very effortlessly. And there's so many examples of when we don't get engaged with the child in a fighting way, and instead we engage with the child in a helpful way, we start to show them how to be regulated. In our work, we call it being a regulating partner. We do it with them until they can do it for themselves.
So the goal is that they are able to, as you say, self-regulate.
Absolutely.
But there needs to be this period where they're modeling with the adult.
They literally experience it with me until they can do it for themselves.
Can you work with the child and not with the parents, Anne, as you come into various settings?
Mary, that's such an important question. When we first started to do the work, of course we thought of working with the parents. And what we realized with our most severely dysregulated children who are often getting kicked out of schools, getting kicked out of daycares, what we realized is that many times their parents were also incredibly stressed. And so we made a mindset change, not that we would work without the parent, but that often we could help the child learn these skills so that the child became easier to parent. And so then we were adding something to the family's experience. We also found that we had a window of opportunity. So in my program, we work with children 3 to 3rd grade, because if children don't get into school, they become more and more at risk.
Yes.
Now, in the community, I think there's many windows, but I think there's sometimes that we can really focus on the child, and the child can become an agent, not only in changing their own destiny, but I think in changing their family's history.
So the child becomes less of a stressor
Exactly.
for the family unit.
Yes. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So in a sense, you're not trying to do everything.
No, we're not trying to do everything. We're really saying these are children who have missed out on some essential skills or capacities, and if we do it with them, they can learn to do it for themselves, and then they can keep learning.
Do you think ideally the intervention by this person or persons comes at 3 rather than 8?
I love getting kids younger than older. But often, 3 people are still a little bit patient, and the stresses aren't so great. My favorite is getting them at 4 and 5, right as they're going into kindergarten.
Oh, okay.
Because that's when they're available to learning, they want to learn, and then they get so discouraged when they can't make it work. By 8, they're almost defeated, and that's very hard to see.
That's hard to see, isn't it?
It's very hard to see.
And I've heard too that if kids aren't reading fairly well by 3rd grade, school gets harder and harder, and self-esteem goes down.
Exactly, Mary.
So that if you're misbehaving in class, you're not learning as well. So I mean, they go together, don't they?
And they do, and they go together in the reverse. When you're not learning so well, you feel humiliated, and then you start to misbehave.
Yes, as a way to get attention, probably.
As a way to get relief, too.
Sure. We're almost out of time already.
I can't believe it.
You know what? I want to pause just for a second. I get to ask her maybe 1 or 2 more questions quickly, but if you're intrigued, and I'm sure you are, she has a manual that's called the Developmental Repair, a training manual, and we're going to put a link to that up on the screen, so get out your paper and pen and jot that down.
And Mary, the good thing about it is Washburn decided to put it online, so it's available at no charge.
And that's
It's
very
kind.
important to know. So a free manual. And Washburn, we should mention.
Yes.
We haven't mentioned Washburn, but
Washburn was
Center.
the experimental lab where we developed this model and continue to use it. It's being used there. It's being used around the state. I'm very grateful that they took this on and made it happen.
And Bush Foundation.
And Bush Foundation funded us for 5 years so that we could take these ideas and develop them into a model. And the Casey Foundation from Washington a year ago identified us as a very promising practice, which is quite an honor.
So this may become a model not only for Minnesota schools and families, but nationally.
We'd like lots of people to think differently.
With what you're sharing, and so excited about this for our kids and for our families, for all of us. So thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you very much, Mary. It was lovely.
It's great to be with you. I've been talking with Anne Gearity. If you tuned in late, you can learn more about her by going to the internet. She's one of our premier social workers in the Midwest here. Thank you for being with us. I'll be back next week. Until then, have a good week.